I'm tired of pretending your simplicity feels romantic instead of limiting, my fiancée said before canceling our plans to spend another weekend with her wealthier friends. I didn't defend myself. Months later, she sat across from someone who accidentally revealed exactly what happened after I left. I'm tired of pretending your simplicity feels romantic instead of limiting. She said it the way you say something you've been practicing in your head for weeks. Calm, measured, like she was finally letting herself say the honest thing. I didn't respond right away. I just stood there in our kitchen, holding a coffee mug, watching her pull on her jacket to leave for another weekend with Veronica and the rest of that crowd. She didn't look back when she walked out. And I remember thinking, that's new. The not looking back part. At the time, I thought that was the worst thing she could say to me. Months later, someone who didn't even know my name would accidentally prove just how wrong she was. If you enjoy real stories like this, subscribe, because what happened next changed everything for me. We had been engaged for 14 months when that morning happened. Together for 3 years before that. 4.5 years total, and I could point to the exact moment the math started not adding up anymore. But I didn't. Not then. I was 36. She was 34. We lived in a suburb outside of Charlotte that was nice without being aggressive about it. Good schools, older trees, the kind of neighborhood where people wave from driveways. I worked in operations consulting, the kind of work that doesn't make for interesting dinner conversation but compounds quietly over time. Meredith was in marketing strategy for a mid-size agency downtown. We had met through a mutual friend, Garrett, at a birthday dinner that neither of us had particularly wanted to attend. We used to laugh about that. By the end, we had stopped laughing about most things. The shift didn't happen overnight. That's what people don't understand about these stories. There's no single moment where someone becomes a different person. There's just a slow accumulation of small moments that you keep rationalizing because you love them and because you remember who they were. Meredith had always been social. That was never the issue. The issue was Veronica. Veronica had married a commercial real estate developer named Qley about 2 years before this. Qley was fine, loud, a little performative about his success, but fundamentally harmless. The problem wasn't Qley. The problem was the world that came with Qley. The dinners, the weekend trips, the lake house in the Outer Banks, the charity events with valet parking, the group chat that Meredith got added to sometime in the spring of the second year of our engagement. After that group chat, things changed. Slowly at first, then all at once. The canceled plans started around that time. Not dramatically, just regularly. We'd have something on the calendar. A winery trip with Malcolm and his girlfriend. A weekend visiting my family. A Saturday we'd loosely agreed was ours. And then Veronica's group would materialize with something better, and Meredith would look at me with that careful expression she'd developed, the one that was almost apologetic but not quite, and say some version of "you don't mind, right?" I minded. I didn't say that, though. I'd just nod and say we could reschedule. And we would reschedule. And then she'd cancel that too. My friend Franklin noticed before I admitted it to myself. We were watching a game at his place one Sunday. One of the Sundays Meredith had opted out of to go to brunch with Veronica's crowd. And he said, without looking away from the TV, "She doing that thing again where she finds better plans?" I told him it wasn't like that. He didn't argue. He just handed me another beer. That should have been my first real warning. The comparisons started subtly. A comment here. An observation there. Qley got Veronica a spa weekend for her birthday. In Asheville. Just the two of them. I had gotten Meredith tickets to see a band she'd mentioned once, 8 months earlier, that she didn't think I'd remembered. She cried when she opened the envelope. That was 6 months before the comparison started. By the time Veronica's birthday gift became a reference point, those tears felt very far away. Brandon flew the whole group to Miami for New Year's. Private charter. Brandon was someone in the group I had met twice. I couldn't have told you what he did for a living. Meredith, apparently, could. Veronica said Qley's looking at a ski chalet in Park City. I listened. I didn't respond the way she wanted me to. I think that was the problem. I wasn't performing envy. I wasn't performing ambition in the language she'd learned to speak. I was just present, steady, working toward things that didn't make good dinner party conversation yet. That stopped being enough somewhere along the way. There was a dinner. About 6 months before everything ended. Meredith had invited me to one of the group's regular gatherings, a thing at a restaurant downtown that was dim and expensive in the way that's meant to signal something. I had come straight from a late client meeting. I was in a good blazer, but not the right blazer, apparently. Qley was holding court at the end of the table. Brandon was talking about a deal. Someone named Prescott was explaining why he only flew business class on domestic flights now. I sat next to Meredith and talked to the person on my other side, a woman named Harper who turned out to be an event organizer and was genuinely interesting, while Meredith angled herself toward Veronica and the rest of the table. On the drive home, she was quiet. Then, you didn't really make an effort tonight. I looked over at her. I talked to people. You talked to Harper about city zoning codes. She brought it up. I was being polite. Cole was right there. You could have connected with him. About what? She turned toward the window. That's exactly what I mean, she said. I didn't know what she meant. Or maybe I did, and I didn't want to yet. That was the night I started understanding that the problem wasn't my behavior. It was my category. Meredith had mentally placed me in a category, and that category didn't match the one she was trying to inhabit. I didn't know what to do with that information, so I filed it away and kept going. My mentor Hudson had a saying he used whenever I'd come to him with a situation I was overthinking. You can't negotiate with someone who's already made up their mind. You can only decide how long you're willing to stand at the table. I had been standing at that table for a long time. The wedding planning had nearly stopped by winter. We had a venue booked, a deposit paid, and a rough date that kept getting pushed. Meredith had lost interest in the details she'd once been excited about. She'd go weeks without mentioning it. When I'd bring it up, she'd say she was just busy. I knew it wasn't that. My attorney, Bennett, had done some work for me the previous year on a business matter, and we'd become friendly enough to grab dinner occasionally. I ran into him at a coffee shop around this time, and he asked how the wedding planning was going. I told him honestly. He looked at me for a moment and said, "You know what I've learned in 20 years of family law? People plan the things they want." I thought about that for a long time after. My business associate Donovan had been pushing me for months to take a meeting with a company called Archway Partners, a mid-sized investment group that was quietly expanding into operational consulting. I had been cautious. The timing never felt right. But that winter, something shifted in me. I think it was the dinner, or the weeks of canceled plans, or the gradual recognition that I had been shrinking myself to avoid conversations that were going to happen anyway. I took the meeting with Archway. Their senior executive, a man named Brooks, was direct and sharp and entirely uninterested in performance. He cared about results and track record and how you handled problems when they became expensive. We talked for 2 hours. He asked hard questions. I answered them plainly. At the end, he said, "I've talked to a lot of consultants. Most of them spend 90% of the meeting managing my impression of them. You just talked." I didn't know if that was a compliment yet. It was. 3 weeks later, I was in early conversations with Archway about a role that would have been unthinkable to me 2 years prior. I didn't tell Meredith right away. There was nothing to tell yet. But something had quietly changed in my professional trajectory, and I was the only one who knew it. Spring came. Meredith and I were moving around each other in the apartment like people who had learned each other's schedules well enough to avoid collision. We still had good nights occasionally. A dinner where we talked the way we used to. A Sunday morning that almost felt like before. But those were becoming the exceptions. One evening I came home to find her on the phone with Veronica, laughing in that way she only laughed with that group now, loud and bright, and a little performed. And when she saw me, she held up a finger like I was an interruption. I went to the kitchen, made dinner for one since I didn't know if she'd eaten. She joined me 20 minutes later, still glowing from the call. Veronica and Cole are doing a group thing in Hilton Head in June. She wants to know if we're in. June was the month we'd tentatively agreed to revisit the wedding date. I told her we'd need to look at the calendar. She said, "It'll be fun. I think you'd actually enjoy it if you let yourself." That phrase, "if you let yourself," sat in me like something cold. The morning she said it, the morning everything finally became clear, had started like any other. I was making coffee. She was getting ready to head out for what had become a routine Saturday thing with Veronica's crowd. A group brunch that led into an afternoon activity I was never specifically invited to, but also never specifically excluded from. I had stopped trying to attend. She came into the kitchen dressed for it. Nice, polished in that way she'd gotten lately, a version of herself that felt curated for an audience I wasn't part of. I said something ordinary, something about the weekend, about maybe taking a walk later if she was home early. And she stopped, put her bag down on the counter. "I'm tired of pretending your simplicity feels romantic instead of limiting." Silence. I set my coffee mug down carefully. She wasn't yelling. Neither was I. That was the thing about us by then. All the damage had been done at low volume. "Okay," I said. "Just that." She seemed to expect something else. Pushback, maybe. Or a question. or the kind of desperate negotiation that would give her something to respond to. I didn't give her any of it. Okay, I said again. And I looked at her with the kind of calm that only comes when you've already been through the hardest part of something in your own head. I think we both know what that means, I said. She didn't argue. She picked up her bag, and she left for brunch. I called Donovan that afternoon. Then I called my financial advisor, Wesley, and asked him to walk me through some numbers I'd been putting off reviewing. Then I called my mother. I didn't explain everything to her yet. I just said I was going through some changes, and I wanted to hear her voice. She talked to me for an hour about nothing important. It was exactly what I needed. The engagement ended formally 2 weeks later. No scene, no dramatics, just a conversation that was honest in the way our last several months hadn't been. Meredith said she was sorry. I believed her. I said I hoped she found what she was looking for. I meant that too. I moved out before the month was over. I had been staying at Malcolm's place in the interim. He had a second room and the good sense not to ask too many questions until I was ready to answer them. Franklin came over the first weekend with food and a six-pack, and we sat on Malcolm's back porch and talked until midnight. He didn't say I told you so. That's how you know who your people are. The months that followed didn't look cinematic from the outside. I want to be clear about that, because these stories sometimes get told like a montage, like there's a training sequence and a breakthrough moment and a clean before and after. It wasn't like that. It was slow. It was some Saturdays that felt genuinely fine and some Sunday nights that didn't. It was waking up in Malcolm's guest room for the first few weeks and needing a moment to remember where I was. But it was also something else. It was mine again. That's the only way I know how to describe it. The pressure to perform a life I didn't actually want, to be measured against men I barely knew who had expensive hobbies and louder personalities and the right kind of car for the right kind of crowd. That pressure lifted the moment she walked out of that kitchen. I hadn't realized how much of myself I'd been managing down. The Archway situation moved faster than expected. Brooks introduced me to Mason, the company director, and we had 2 more conversations that spring. By early summer, I was brought on as a senior consultant on a project that had been struggling for 8 months before I touched it. I don't want to overstate this. I was doing good work in a field I'd been building in for over a decade. This wasn't a transformation. It was a trajectory that had been there all along, waiting for me to stop being distracted. But the work accelerated. I took on 2 additional client relationships through Archway. One of them, a woman named Evelyn, ran a regional logistics company that had significant structural issues. We worked together for 4 months. At the end, she told Mason that I was the first consultant who had actually listened to her team instead of writing over them. Mason passed that along to me in writing. I saved that email. Donovan and I also moved forward on a smaller side venture we'd been circling for a couple of years. A boutique advisory firm that would let us take on project-based work outside of our main roles. It wasn't a big operation. It was deliberate and quiet, and exactly what we both wanted. My neighbor Parker, who I'd barely spoken to in 4 years of living in the area, knocked on my door one evening after I'd moved into a new place that fall. He'd heard through someone in the building that I did consulting work. He had a question about his family business. That question turned into a 6-month project. That's how it works sometimes. You stop trying to be seen, and you become visible. I heard about Meredith occasionally. I wasn't tracking it. I wasn't seeking it. But in a city the size of Charlotte, with the overlap in our networks, information moved without being requested. Garrett mentioned once that she and Veronica had some kind of falling out. He didn't know the details. I didn't ask. Franklin told me, around 8 months after everything, that she had stopped going to the group events as regularly. He'd run into someone who said the crowd had become, his word, exhausting. I didn't feel satisfied by that. I want to be honest about that. I just felt like things were finding their own level. The dinner happened in November. Archway had partnered with a regional business foundation on a fundraiser, one of those charity events with round tables and a keynote speaker and an open bar that people are genuinely grateful for by 8 o'clock. I was there with Donovan and a woman I'd been seeing for a few months, someone I'd met through Claire, a former coworker. Her name was Renata. She was a structural engineer who thought I was funny and called me out when I was being too cautious. I liked her enormously. There were maybe 200 people in the room. A hotel ballroom. The kind of event where you know maybe 30% of the room and spend the evening pleasantly finding out about the other 70. I had been there about an hour when I saw her. Meredith. She was across the ballroom, near one of the round tables by the window. She was with a small group I didn't recognize. She looked fine. She always looked fine. But there was something different about her in that room, a kind of stillness I hadn't seen before. I registered her presence the way you register weather, noted it, adjusted slightly, moved on. Renata and I drifted toward the bar. I introduced her to Mason and his wife. We found Donovan and his girlfriend Priya, and the four of us ended up at a table near the center of the room. I wasn't thinking about Meredith anymore. I learned what happened later. Not from Meredith. From Felicity. Felicity was a mutual acquaintance, someone Meredith and I had known socially. The kind of person you see at events and have a genuine conversation with, and then don't contact for 6 months. She reached out to me 2 weeks after the dinner, said she'd been there that night, and wanted to tell me something she'd witnessed. She had been seated at the same table as Meredith. Partway through the evening, the conversation had turned toward Archway. Someone at the table knew Brooks or knew of the firm, and the name of the project I'd led earlier that year came up. The structural turnaround. Apparently, it had gotten some attention in business circles because of how cleanly it had been executed. The woman who brought it up, Felicity, didn't know her name, was talking about it the way people talk about a thing they find genuinely impressive. And she mentioned the lead consultant. Not by name at first, just by description. Then she said the name. Felicity watched Meredith's face. She said it was like watching someone do a quiet calculation they weren't expecting to have to do. The woman kept going, talking about the firm Donovan and I had set up, about Evelyn's endorsement that had apparently circulated further than I'd known, about the reputation that had been building in circles I wasn't even fully aware of. She said the community leader at the table, a woman named Madeline who apparently knew Mason, said something about the kind of person you didn't find often. The kind who built things without needing the room to notice. Meredith, according to Felicity, was very quiet for the rest of the dinner. She left before the keynote. Felicity told me she wasn't sure if she should reach out. She said she decided to because she'd always thought we were the kind of person who deserved to know, not as a way to reopen anything, but because sometimes you need to hear that the version of you someone dismissed wasn't the real version. I appreciated that. I thought about the morning in the kitchen, the coffee mug, the way she'd said simplicity like it was a verdict. I thought about the months after, the work, the quiet Saturdays that had eventually stopped feeling like loss and started feeling like room. I thought about Renata, who had texted me that morning a photo of a structural diagram she thought was funny and I had laughed out loud at in a coffee shop. I didn't feel like calling Meredith. I didn't feel like sending a message. I felt like finishing my coffee. I talked to Hudson about it eventually, my mentor, the one with the saying about standing at tables. He listened the way he always did, without interrupting. When I was done, he said, "Do you know what I think the real story is?" I waited. Not that she was wrong about you. Not that you were right all along. The real story is that you were ready to move when it was time to move. A lot of people aren't. They keep standing at the table. I thought about that. She wasn't measuring the wrong person, I said. She was just using the wrong measurements. He pointed at me. That, he said. Write that down. I didn't write it down, but I remembered it. I don't think about Meredith often. When I do, it's without anger. That's not performance. It's just the honest result of enough time and enough forward motion. I think she genuinely believed what she said that morning. I think she had been in that social world long enough that its vocabulary had become her own, and inside that vocabulary, what I was, steady, unflashy, building in ways that didn't photograph well, genuinely looked like limitation. That's not malice. That's just a certain kind of blindness. The kind that only clears when you're sitting across from someone who accidentally tells you the story you missed while you were looking somewhere else. Last month, my firm picked up its largest client to date, a regional infrastructure company looking to restructure operations across 3 states. Mason made an introduction. Brooks wrote a recommendation. Evelyn passed along my name unsolicited to someone on their board. That's years of quiet work moving in the same direction, finally reaching a weight that others can feel. Donovan and I had dinner to market. A good restaurant, not expensive in a performative way, just good. We talked about what comes next. On the walk home, I thought about what the version of me 4 years ago would have made of all this. I think he would have been relieved. Not because of the success, but because the work finally felt like his. Not measured against someone else's definition. Not calibrated to impress the wrong room. Just his. She spent months searching for a more impressive life, only to discover she had already walked away from it.